And but it looks like it might be only 2 people tonight if they don't join soon.
That's fine. All right. I'm gonna try and make sure I get through all my slides correctly. And it looks like Kelly's still in here, but Jean and John, if there are any difficulties, FCC cannot help in the middle of session, but if you email ilr@frederick.edu, somebody can help you that way. And I should have had it on the screen, but if you want to write down my cell phone to let me know if you're late or trying to get on and can't get on, my cell phone is 714-559-8025. And you can text me and let me know if you're having difficulties, and I'll wait. That's totally fine. Just one more time for good measure. That cell phone, 714-559-8025. Okay, do I have any questions so far about housekeeping things or anything else that we need to cover?
No.
No? Jean? You good? Oh, Jean is still on mute, sorry.
Sorry, no, yeah, I'm sorry. I had opened up another menu and it wouldn't let me out.
Oh,
I was just wondering about next Monday.
sure.
If I was the only one who had, a horde of trick-or-treaters coming to my house between 6 and 7:30.
Yeah, Kelly said that there's no holiday, so we can meet, but I'm also flexible for time. Why don't I write it down to reach out and we'll set something up? Because I can certainly go later or earlier. Yeah, because it will not interrupt my trick-or-treating. I will email everybody after our first session to see about next week.
Okay, I mean, it's possible that I could do it. I would just have to hide somewhere and make my husband take care of all
Yeah.
the trick-or-treating.
That's fine. Well, we can have the conversation by email. I think that's not a problem at all.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. If there's just 2 of us, you guys can stay off mute. I mean, even with 4 or 5, we should be okay. So if that's what you'd like to, just if there's a question that you have, do try and raise your hand. If not, that's not a big deal. But this is also, I don't know if I've taught remotely for some time. I've taken classes remotely, and remote classes after COVID is actually what caused my mom to retire from teaching for grade school, because she didn't want to deal with the technology. And I certainly feel for her. Okay, now is the time to find out if my slides work.
Mhm.
Okay, I think they do. So a little bit about me first. I have 2 graduate theology degrees, the first from Duke University in Christian ethics, and the second from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in systematic and historical theology. They couldn't have been more boring, but they certainly awoke something in me that made me really want to kind of dive into this stuff. The part of my story also is having gotten out of the military after 6 years, from 2000 to 2006, including a deployment to Iraq in 2004. My interest is in political theology in particular, but also interpretation and hermeneutics, which we'll talk about in a little while. I'm also giving a course in the spring, God is With Us, War in the Bible, where I'll talk about the historical context of Israel and the emergence of rabbinic Judaism and the Roman setting and the early church, which I'm really excited about, and probably is it's going to be a really interesting class, but I'll be giving that in the spring. So be on the lookout for it when you get the next catalog. I'm also on social media as @IamLoganMI. I'm mostly on Twitter, not really on Facebook, but I also have a website where you can look at some of my blogs and other accomplishments, things that I like to brag about. But with that being said, there's just a couple of you, but I'd like to hear, starting with Jean, since I have you at the top of my little listicle of faces. Jean, why don't you tell me a little bit about what interested you in the course, where you're coming from, what kind of experience you have, with sacred texts and anything that you want to share about yourself.
Okay, well, all of my degrees in school are in religion or theology. So I majored in religion in college, and as part of the religion major back in the day, we had to take a round of biblical courses. And I enjoyed it very much, but that didn't become my focus. So I have a master's and a PhD in theological studies from Emory University. And I was, I'm more of an academician sort of student of religion. I like the historical and cultural context of it, what makes people believe what they believe in certain periods of time. So I ended up doing my dissertation on an Indian mystic named Aurobindo Ghosh. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was slightly younger than Gandhi, but he was educated in England and went back to India and was trying to sort of modernize Hinduism, I guess you said. So he would take a lot of Western ideas and use Sanskrit terms to apply to them and create this whole yogic system. So I was always interested in religion. I really enjoyed studying the Bible, but I'm sure that the scholarship has come a long way since the 70s. So that's kind of why I'm here.
Awesome. And John, anything you'd like to share and reasons that you're interested in the course?
Well, sounds like I'm the only one without a theology degree.
It's okay.
You're
You're still cool in our book.
I haven't used it. So.
I'm retired a couple years ago as an attorney, and just looking to learn a little more about the Bible. I've taken one class on Paul and the letters of Paul, and just see what I can find out.
Cool. Yeah, it sounds like y'all are kind of, well, Gene's done more than scratch the surface, but hopefully I'll have a thing or two up my sleeve that might interest both of you. We can go ahead and launch into it. So as y'all have noticed, that the title of the course is Biblical Literature, and that begs the question, what is a Bible and what do I mean by biblical literature? I always start with etymology. It's a study of the progression or the heritage of words. It's not definition, but it's about the meaning of words, where the words that we use come from and why and how they've been used. And so the Bible comes to us from Latin, biblia, and from there it comes from the Greek biblios. And as far as I can tell, the Romans or the Latin speakers just transliterated the Greek biblia, but it's also the name of a Greek town known for exporting Egyptian papyrus named Byblos. And so papyrus is some of the earliest forms in the West that we used for paper for writing things down. Bible is literally translated just book, Byblos. But the Bible, according to Jews and Christians and Muslims, is not your typical book. It is not a single author with linear stream of consciousness or stream of thought. It's actually a collection of ghostwriters written over several periods of time, and then eventually being compiled and joined together as one sacred text. What makes a Bible or a book holy is in the eyes of the beholder, the eyes of the community that creates it. This course will adopt a broadly Christian perspective, as I mentioned in my email, but the Bible didn't start there. What Christians came to call the Old Testament was already Holy Scripture to Jews. And I want to pause and mention, I'll go over this in a moment, but Christians adopted the Hebrew Bible and then added letters, narrative, and called it the New Testament. They also kind of reworked some of the books. Islam does not take the Hebrew Bible and or the Christian Bible wholesale and then add the Quran. The Quran is its own thing, and so I won't be going much into it. I try to keep a pretty pluralistic mindset, worldview. But in terms of the text that we're going to be looking at, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, it just doesn't get grouped into it that same way. So before the Common Era, or BCE, if you're familiar with BC and AD, before Christ, and Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, before the Common Era, a holy book was already being circulated among the Jews. In Hebrew, which is read from right to left, the Bible is called the Tanakh, an acronym formed by the first letters of the three major collections within the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, translated roughly meaning the law, the prophets, and the writings. The Hebrew consonants you can see on the right, Tav, Nun, and Kaf, become the Tanakh. I was going to make the TN and K red, but that might have been confusing. But in between the English and the bottom, you can see where the Hebrew, modern Hebrew, is written the Tanakh, and you can tell in the Ketuvim, the first letter of the principal root is highlighted. The two characters before that are like prepositions. So it's literally just an acronym, Tanakh. And then they throw the vowels are those little dots and T's and pairs of dots. Those are vowels, also called the Masorets, which you may have heard, and I think I put in here, the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew version of the Bible that we're going to talk about, the oldest copy of which doesn't date until like the 11th or 12th century. They added the vowels to clarify what the text is saying. But if you go to a synagogue, many synagogues, I think this may be different for progressive Jewish denominations, I'm not sure, they leave all the vowels out. And so the Masoretic text is the full text with the vowels, and then the Tanakh, depending, what denomination of Jewish traditions you're talking about, they'll very often leave out all the vowels. The basic units of the Hebrew language are typically 3 consonant root words. And from there, vowels and additional consonants are added to create families of words with divergent meanings based on a common root. So for example, I gave this other study where we talked about the word milchama, which is war, and lacham, which is fight, and a related root. The root itself, or the English equivalents, L, H, and M, lacham. But if you change around the vowels, you get lochem, which is obese, because fighting and war is about overconsumption. It's about devouring. And so the LHM root word can give birth to all these other words that can trace their origin to this one word. So obesity, to be armed, is similar to being obese. And so this gives us clues into what the ancient Hebraic imagination kind of attuned its audience for. The oldest known version of the Hebrew Bible, ironically, is in Greek, a text that scholars call the Septuagint, meaning 70, and expressed as LXX in Roman numerals, the L being 50 and the X being 2 tens, 50 plus 10 twice is 70. According to legend, there were 70 rabbis who all took a text that we no longer have in Hebrew. Parts of it were Aramaic, and they translated it when in the 3rd century BCE. And according to the legend, they all created this 70 identical copies of the Hebrew Bible, and that in Greek, and that becomes the Septuagint. The earliest translations, the oldest extant that we have, are only from this first section called the Torah, or Law, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Greek versions of the Nevi'im and Ketuvim came centuries later, around or just after when the early church was forming. But there were Greek texts. We don't have copies of them. There are Hebrew texts. We don't have copies of them. And I'll try not to go too deeply into that. It fascinates me to no end. But We'll come back to the texts themselves later. We're going to talk about the story and elements of the story and how the Hebrew Bible sets up, or for Christians, how it is pointing to and how it creates one story. But in order to do that, we need to talk about the filters through which these texts have come to us from thousands of years ago and thousands of miles away. So how did ancient Greek and eventually Hebrew texts make it into the drawers of bedstands in hotels across America? Let's talk about translation. Exegesis is the science of determining what was said by an author to their audience back then and there. Exegetes, which is to say professional person who does exegesis, usually a scholar, sometimes armchair exegetes like myself. They're familiar with the meanings of words, called etymology, the grammatical relationship between them and sentences, and the word choice of the specific codex where manuscripts differ from one another. A codex is a larger collection of manuscripts. Sometimes those manuscripts are meant to be together. Sometimes manuscripts are, scholars believe, belong somewhere else to another codex, but they're using it for this codex because it probably fits. But a codex is one entire unit of a manuscript. Sometimes they're fragments, sometimes they're entire books, like the Dead Sea Scrolls have entire copies of Isaiah and Lamentations, etc. And so codex, the plural of which is codices, a codex is one entire unit. One of the most complete and therefore most heavily used codices is the Leningrad Codex, which I think is in Greek. It's a Septuagint. Then within codices, we have manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts, and that's where they're stored in museums and they're gone over with like magnifying glasses to determine age and all that stuff. In trying to understand an ancient text in the here and now, every reader employs their own hermeneutic. And hermeneutic is a fancy word for interpretation. It's Greek. It comes from, you might hear in it, the Greek god Hermes, the messenger of the gods. And hermeneutic is a really interesting thing because we all do hermeneutics, even if we know nothing about exegesis. Our own experiences and situation dictate what is common sense to all of us. To understand a text, whether we're professionals or not, we must be able to identify and distinguish between our own setting and context from the setting and context of the texts that we read. Put another way, I am not an ancient Israelite. I am a 21st century American. I'm a millennial. I'm an old millennial. So I come to these texts with all kinds of accumulated assumptions, beliefs, that hermeneutics depend upon, but that are kept in check by exegesis, by good exegesis. There are hundreds of English translations available, but good exegesis is always the proper control for hermeneutics. You have to do some work around getting at the original intent, which is to say the original author or authors, the original audience, get inside their mind frame in order to understand what it might say to us today. It's an exercise in humility, in essence. We may think that we know what common sense dictates, but culture actually shapes what we think of as common sense, as the things that we take for granted. So there are two kinds of choices that translators must take. Those are textual and linguistic. Textual are the actual wording of the original manuscript. You have to do some exegesis. The second is linguistic, which is based on his or her audience and their theory of translation. Major theories of translation include formal equivalence or literal, which is closer to the original language. It's more literal to the actual words themselves, and some of the more popular translations include the American Standard Version, which is popular within the Catholic Church, the King James Version, which is popular in the evangelicals, and the English Standard Version. Many of its derivations, like the NRSV and others, are standard often for academics, but not always. The second major theory of translation is functional equivalence. It's a dynamic translation that is closer to the receptor language, but keeps intact as much of the ideas and the structure and the wording of the original language itself. Some of those translations include the New American Bible, Common English Bible, or the New International Version, NIV. Finally, there are free translations, otherwise known as paraphrases. Paraphrases preserve the idea behind the text more than the text itself. Some examples include the Message, the Good News Bible, or if you know the Cotton Patch Gospels that came out of Quantity of Farms, and the scholar Clarence Jordan back in the 60s, he died before he can complete the whole Bible, but he started with the Gospels, and it reoriented a lot of the locations and wordings. So for example, Peter, whose name means rock, Petros, he names this character in Cotton Patch Gospels Rock. And instead of Rome, it becomes Atlanta, because he's writing in Georgian. That was the era of Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. So these are paraphrases that aim to preserve the ideas and the function of the text more than the text itself. I'm curious what translation y'all are most familiar with, if any, and what your experience or opinions are of some of the different translations.
I have the American Standard Version, and it's about the only one I've dealt with, I think.
Is that just by default, or do you like
Catholic.
it?
I'm
Okay.
Catholic, so that sort of guides you that way.
Okay. Jean, what about you?
Basically the same, American Standard Version, or Revised Standard Version, I think is what they called it when I was growing up anyway. And then I like the King James just for the more poetical aspects of it, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I think when I was in seminary 10 years ago, the NRSV was kind of standard. The RSV was good, but I think the NRSV, among other things, took more gender neutral pronouns.
Mhm.
And part of that is because there are some there, so it's split, and there's a hot debate in Christianity as to the gendered pronouns of God. And so the NRSV, any time that seemed to be able to, it would, I've got to pull up the chat screen real quick, sorry. Oh, that's just Kelly, okay. Any time that it could, it took a neutral gendered pronoun for God. Some of them are specific, but some of them are like man is short for mankind or humanity. And so they took some liberties in neutralizing some of the gendered language. The King James Version, which is more popular for evangelicals. I've even been told, I remember when before I got to seminary, I was flipping through a Bible in a bookstore like Barnes Noble. And an older gentleman said, well, I can't remember what version, it's probably NIV. That's one that I used when I was younger, I really liked. He said, the only real Bible is King James Version. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, it's God's word. And I was like, I don't think that's how it works. But it gets like people really, people find what they like and they stick to it. I'm one of those people. I've never had anything in and out other than like the number 3 or like that's the California thing. I can't remember what I had in Frederick, but and that's fine. But one of the important things that I want to kind of impart, like God doesn't speak in English, and when God speaks, it's not exactly what we often think. And if few of us speak, ancient Hebrew fluently. And so if we take for granted that we're getting something from somebody else between God and us, we are more liable to make mistakes or liberties with a text that I don't think the text would want us to have. And so to give us an example, this is the wrong order. Let me see. Yeah. So let's just take for an example the very first lines of Genesis. You'll remember King James is one of the more literal ones. Does anybody want to read that for the rest of us?
Well,
I was going to suggest Jean, since you mentioned that.
okay, but I have my little thumbnail pictures blocking. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, I had to move mine too.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
Yeah, and it sounds poetic. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface. I can hear, like, I don't know, Darth Vader or something reading. I can't remember his name. James, I can't remember.
James Earl Jones.
James Earl Jones, yeah. Now that I'll read the New International Version. That's one that I read when I was in the military, because I don't know, whoever published NIV was really friendly with the armed forces, and so all of the soldiers' Bibles were in NIV. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, singular. It's kind of weird. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. I don't know what the deep is. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, in each of these, y'all notice how Spirit and God are capitalized? That's how you know it's a Christian translation. And there are English Jewish translations, the Jewish Study Bible, the Tanakh, the Jewish Publication Society. They do not capitalize Spirit. There are not three gods in one, as Christians tend to believe. And so Spirit is not capitalized. It's the Ruach? No. Ruach is breath. Spirit is, I can't remember. But even little editorial choices like that disclose the motivation and the interests of its authors. And so when it was written, or when it existed in Hebrew, it was just the Spirit of God was a part of God. It wasn't a separate, what Christians call Godhead. And so now let's look at a paraphrase, The Message by Eugene Peterson. Do you want to read that for us, John?
Yeah. First, this God created the heavens and earth, all you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's Spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss.
Yeah. What do y'all see? What kind of stands out to you with the paraphrase?
I mean, it's much more casual, I guess, or yeah.
And much more flowery, almost.
Yeah.
A lot of imagery and
Yeah.
different, like, yeah.
It seems to me like there's certain choices being made, like, what does Peterson mean by brooded? All it says in the others is the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, Spirit of God moved upon the waters. But Peterson, brooded is kind of loaded. Like, I don't know why he made that choice. It does affect the kind of emotional content of the text. Bottomless emptiness and inky blackness. When I read, when I do Hebrew, I don't do grammar. I'm very interested in etymology. That's how it's one of my hobbies. And the two words that were formless and empty in King James are, I can't remember what they are in Hebrew, but they rhyme. And so it's a memory technique as well. Some languages, like Hawaiian, for example, they were never intended originally to be written down. Writing is actually foreign to human beings. We weren't, writing is something that we've created. Language is inherent, but writing is different. So Hawaiians, they never had a spoken or a written language until James Cook came. And then the missionaries took English characters and applied them to the sounds that they made. And that's transliteration. That's taking the sounds of one language and applying the characters and the alphabet of another language. And then once they did that, they went around transcribing the Hawaiian creation myth, et cetera, et cetera. And like Hebrew, Hawaiian is this primitive language that packs a whole lot of meaning into fewer words. English, by contrast, is this really complex language. It borrows from like Arabic and French and like Norse and all these other things. So we have like 4 different words for like because or something. But older languages, or languages that have been preserved for longer amounts of time in their original-ish content, will have these root words that have all kinds of meanings that get sussed out that may not actually have other words. And so the blackness, formlessness, when I read it as a combat vet, and a lot of talk in veteran spaces is about PTSD and moral injury and all that stuff. And I think of the blackness one. I can't remember what it is in Hebrew. It makes me think of melancholia, because melancholia was one of the oldest words for PTSD in Spain during the First World War or something. And so melancholia makes me think of brooding, of like homesickness, of being just kind of restless and uneasy. And so I can kind of see maybe where Peterson has chosen this word, God's Spirit brooded like a bird, because in Greek, the Septuagint, it's melancholia. And we know, or we may know, what melancholia means. It means kind of be depressed and kind of like uneasy. Even if the King James Version, the NIV, say it's just void and dark. But Hebrew and most really ancient languages have to pack all this meaning into just a couple of words. And the other words that we add on, like brooding, inky, those are all words that Hebrew doesn't have. It has to imply. And that's part of the reason I love getting into the Bible so much, because there's so much that you can kind of infer from it. And you have to be careful. You have to have good exegesis, but it means there's so much really fun stuff to kind of pull out of it. And so the last little bit of the course, we're going to end pretty early. I want to zoom out a little bit in a moment and look at the full Bible. You'll remember the first 5 books are called the Torah in the Tanakh. In Greek, they're known as the Pentateuch, from pente, meaning 5, and tukos, meaning tool, scroll, or book. It's the only section of the Hebrew Bible that Christianity preserved in its original order. For Jews and Christians alike, the first 5 books of the Bible are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I remember, because I was promised a soccer ball if I could recite the first 5 books of the Bible. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was like 6 years old. I got my first soccer ball. So I remembered the order of the first 5 books of the Bible. And it's the only section that has been preserved from Judaism in Christianity. But where did these names come from? We can see that they have meant something else before they reached our own ears. In short, we just kind of inherited these words from the Greek descriptors. So in the Pentateuch, Genesis means creation. Exodos means exit. Luetikon or Levitikon means of the Levites or relating to the Levites. Arithmoi means numbers, if you think of like arithmetic and math. And then finally, Deuteronomion for the second Deutero and Nomos law, the second law. And I think I talked about this next week, but Deuteronomy fascinates me because it's almost like breaking the fourth wall. It's included in the canon from as early as the 3rd century, but it's actually, the Bible describes the discovery of this second law, and you can kind of see where some of the party or parties responsible for Deuteronomy have some interest in some of the other books of the Bible. We'll get to that next week. And finally, in Hebrew, the Hebrew titles for the books are called principets. They are the first words or the first line of the text itself. The Pentateuch in Greek, you can see, kind of revolves around a theme: creation of the world in Genesis, the exit from Egypt in Exodus, the Levites and the Levitical code in Leviticus. The numbers that's all about the distribution of land and it's very numbers based. And then finally, Deuteronomy is a retelling of much of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And again, we'll get into that next week. It's fascinating to look at, how they compare and everything. But in Hebrew, Bereshit is just the first word that begins the Bible. In the beginning. The Exodus is Shemot because it begins. These are the names of those who were in Exodus at the time. Leviticus, and it just starts Vayikra, and he called a number of, it goes through the tribes and everything else. Numbers begins in the desert, the Midbar. And then finally, these are the things, or these are the words that were written by blah, blah, blah. And so the Torah, and even with the Tanakh, it's just an acronym of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Hebrew isn't all that interested in like assigning a theme or like prompting you to what to expect. If you've if you've gone through an English Bible and you see like little like subtitles, those aren't there in the text. They never were. Those are an invention of about the 17th or 18th century, where literacy was improving, and people like you and I, who like maybe didn't grow up in nobility, were all of a sudden reading. And so the church and the priests wanted to give you a little hint. And that was in the Western kind of DNA from the beginning. We like to put things together by theme, whereas the Hebrew language and the Semitic kind of imagination is just much more practical. The first words of the text are the title of the text. So moving on, zooming out one more time into the Tanakh more broadly. Here I've preserved the remaining two sections of the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. And I'll let you take a look for a little while. I've put some colors on that, we'll see in the next slide. But it groups them into two: the prophets and the writings. And within that, and these are informal, most Jews that I've spoken to in most like study Bibles and academic books I've read, they refer to the former prophets, the latter prophets, the 12, and then Sifrei Emet is again another acronym. Emet, you can see with the T, M, and I. It's an acronym that also is the root word for truth, and so they call it the books of truth when it's Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. And then you have the 5 scrolls, Hamesh Megillot, and then Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles are all kind of pushed over to the other side. They aren't prophets like Samuel and Kings with Chronicles, because Chronicles tries to assign meaning, divine meaning, to many of the same events that occur in Samuel and Kings. Samuel and Kings is almost one big history book that the Christians will see later split into 2 books because they're so long they take up 2 scrolls. But Chronicles kind of puts God on top of that history, and it seems as though the chronicler, the community or the person that created Chronicles, wants to see God active in all these boring details, largely in Kings, but also in Samuel. And so Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah are almost intertestamental writings. They are the latest that were composed chronologically. And so they kind of got tagged on at the end, and not all ancient manuscripts considered Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah as part of the Hebrew Bible canon. You can see that some of the books that you might think of as history books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, they're considered the former prophets. And then the major prophets that Christians might call, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They come later. They feature as characters in some of the former prophets and then some of the minor 12 prophets. But yeah, so this is the Tanakh canon. The canon is literally just means list. That's the order that these books were put in by those who created the Hebrew Bible. Ready to turn? I can also save this as an image and send it. And luckily, there's nothing behind our faces. It's just blank white space.
How does this differ from what generally thought of as the Christian Old Testament?
I am about to show you. Excellent.
Oh,
question.
okay, all right.
So you'll see at the bottom, I've put Catholic canon. Little c Catholic means universal. And through the first 1,000 years of the Common Era, well, let me correct that. From about the 4th century to about the 11th century, Christianity was more unified than it is now. And they all mostly ascribed this canon, this list, in this order through about, the 11th century. It was formalized in, let's see, 325, the late 4th century, between 325 and 380. This is the Council of Nicaea, which legalized, or was the first council when the religion was legalized, overseen by Emperor Constantine. But the first formal conciliatory agreement, which is to say all the Christian leaders, the bishops, came together at the Council of Chalcedon, I think. That was the first evidence we have of an agreement among bishops that this is the list that we're going to put our Bibles in. And now you'll see I've preserved some of the colors. And you can tell where the Christian imagination has added this section we call history, and that's informal. Some people use it. It's not in your Bible, but it's like, it's one of those things that clearly we've reordered things. We've kept poetry and wisdom, and we've kept prophets. We've counted Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings as history rather than prophets, as the Tanakh did. We've also explicitly split them into 2 books. They've always been on 2 scrolls, but when scribes began, well, how do I put this? Before the advent of the book, right, the Gutenberg press, right, which happened to coincide with the Luther's Protestant Reformation. There were no chapters, there were no verses, there were no subtitles and titles. It was, a book, and then it read like a book. Well, kind of a boring book, but a book. And when the book was invented, for lack of a better word, we went about putting these chapters and verses in there. We also started segmenting out. So some of the earlier versions of the Bible had a section like Nevi'im and Ketuvim that says history, but that didn't really last all that much. And to that end, the 2 scrolls of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were identified separately. So you have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, just as a way of referencing where we're talking about, to reduce the numbers. So there's not like Samuel 201 verse 5 or something. And so there were those accommodations that were taken later, but the little c Catholic Church, as I pointed out with the colors, begins kind of splitting things out. So Joshua and Judges get put under history instead of prophets, same with Samuel and Kings. Out of poetry, or out of wisdom, comes Ruth, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and that's also reordered in a weird way. Esther chronologically was composed and takes place before Ezra and Nehemiah, so I don't know why they did that. And then Lamentations, which is largely believed to have been written by Jeremiah, and Daniel were put into the prophets and moved out of wisdom. And then finally in black, you can see that they added, the little c Catholic Church added Tobit Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, and then finally Baruch and Maccabees, which were intertestamental writings. They were written after Ezra and Nehemiah, after the Septuagint was composed, after the Hebrew canon was codified, but the early Christian church decided to add them because they believed they were helpful, and they were referenced as any other book. What happens, however, is the first major split in Christianity, like major split, I think that's fair enough to say, is in 1024 between the Roman Catholic Latin Church out of Rome and the Greek Orthodox Church out of Byzantium, or it'll become known as the Greek Orthodox Church. And I don't follow that too much. I'm taking a largely Western approach to Christianity. But in 1024 they split, and the Greek Orthodox Church started adding things and reordering things, and I did not grab a list of that myself. But the Big C Catholic Church then kept these and kind of codified them for themselves. And for about 500 years, this is the Western Christian canon of the Bible. And I've gotten rid of the colors because, for Christians, they especially in the medieval period, didn't really pay much attention. And if they did, they didn't particularly like the Jewish heritage that they had inherited. And then in the 1500s, 16th century, we have the Protestant Reformation. And all they did was they got rid of the intertestamental writings that did not appear in the Hebrew Bible, and they called them apocrypha, from apokryphos, which means hidden or secret, depending how you translate it. And so some Protestant Bibles include the apocrypha, some exclude it. But these are intertestamental writings that Luther and the Protestant reformers thought, you know what? No, we're not gonna give those the same credibility as the books that appeared in the Hebrew Bible, but they kept the Big C Catholic ordering of the book. So you'll see Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra. That's the same order that the Little C Catholic Church held, but that had changed from the Hebrew Bible. And I think that is the totality of today's lesson. I want to take some time to go over any questions or discuss any things that you noticed or had lingering questions about. I want to hear from you what you thought so far.
Well, just in terms of the language that the Bible was prepared in, or originally written in, I'm not sure I understood exactly what that was.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mentioned earlier that there were, we could call them ghostwriters, and we'll talk a little bit about this next week. The scholarly consensus is that almost all books in the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament originally existed as some kind of text or story. It might have been oral, it might have been written down, it might have existed in pieces. Like we know that, like Lamentations, there was like a letter of Jeremiah that was kind of brought into Lamentations that was separate before. And so, speaking historically, chronologically, and I probably should have put this in. Well, I actually do have a slide for it next week. Around the 19th century BCE, this is the first Babylonian dynasty. Mesopotamia is in its heyday, and that is when the Enuma Elish is written, the Babylonian creation myth. And Genesis, for example, seems to be answering a lot of the theology and cosmology in the Enuma Elish. And so scholars think that Genesis, as we know it now, began taking shape in in contradistinction to the Babylonian creation myth. And then once the creation story is completed, they start adding in the stuff with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and Egypt, but that got mushed together. That was likely at some point its own distinct story, Abraham and the patriarchs. But through the years, that imaginative rebuke of the Babylonian creation myth began taking shape and got passed around. People were, litmus testing and focus grouping, what the temperature in the room was with the Jews in exile in Babylon. And so over time, that becomes more formalized into, concrete texts that then get entered into what we now see as Genesis. And there's something I'll talk about next week called the documentary hypothesis that proposes that there are up to 4 different main sources for the first 5 books of the Bible. One group that seems to like calling God Yahweh, another group that seems to like to call God Elohim, another group that only really cares about the Levitical code, and then another group, there's 4 or 5 depending how you act, or depending how you kind of parse it out. Then there's a group that actually puts them all together, the reductionists. And then Deuteronomy is its own little thing. And the Deuteronomist may have gone back and added and edited some of the stuff from Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. So over time, these, whispered stories and cultural touch points that are important to the Israelites, the Jews, they slowly but surely come under pressure to spontaneously kind of create, not spontaneously, but like at some point, the Jews felt the need to put these together in actual text. And so they began doing that. And a lot of scholars believe that began about the 1800s BCE, which happens to be when the Babylonian creation myth was being created. It talks a lot about Marduk and how the end of the Enuma Elish, they're building the city with a tower, and it's Babylon. And so there are these little tiny clues that help textual critics make guesses as to how these different stories come together from, a family story here, a song or a canticle here, like the Song of Deborah. A lot of scholars think is the oldest kind of coherent unit of the Hebrew Bible. And it's when Deborah has overseen the destruction of Sisera and Jael, this woman who kills Sisera with the tent peg through it's really crude language, but it all works together. And so like the Song of Deborah in Judges 4 and 5 and the battle against Sisera, that like a lot of scholars think that was the first written piece that eventually becomes the Hebrew Bible. And so that's the long answer, but I hope it kind of gives some hint to where these things came from. I'll give you another example. I've written a couple of books. My first one was about getting out of the military. And I opened the book called Reborn on the 4th of July. I opened the book with this memory I have of an ambush in the Jaff. And it always just existed in the back of my mind, like this little narrative thing. And when I sat down, when I finally got a contract, I had to start writing. That was the first thing I wrote. And I didn't intend for it to be the beginning, but it did. It just kind of seemed to work the way, the story that I saw in my own life. It's just kind of the way it took shape. And so Genesis, Deuteronomy, all the rest, they give us an idea of what this ancient culture was talking about, how they talked about it, what informed what they thought about things. And eventually they began writing them down and then, turned it into the publisher, basically. So these stories, Genesis, even, Abraham, Joseph, Technicolor Dreamcoat, these were already getting passed around before, 2000 years before the Common Era. And then something happened, probably the Babylonian captivity, that got the Israelites to think, oh, you know what, we need to write this down before we forget it. We need to write it down to give us something to remember who we were before we were called to be this thing that Babylon wants us to be. And so did that address your question?
So they were originally written in some kind of local vernacular. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
Hebrew has survived surprisingly intact. There were, there were dialects, but the modern Hebrew has done a really good, and the state of Israel has done a really good job preserving and reviving even ancient Hebrew. In Jesus's day, Aramaic was kind of the I don't want to say sloppy Hebrew, but they're both Semitic languages. They're related to one another, but they're not the same thing. Hebrew was the language of the priests, was the language of the most devoted. It was the language of the synagogue, of the rabbis. And so, yeah, these stories were concocted and then composed in Hebrew, but they probably weren't preserved because, the Jews were always a minority. The people who are in power, the people who have more numbers. And so we have the oldest manuscripts we have are in Greek because the project of Alexander and the Hellenists was what it was. Like they wanted to spread their culture. And to do that, you need language, you need records, you need artifacts, right? And so it was probably, maybe even being Alexander the Great himself, who, according to legend, employed these 70 rabbis to make a Greek version of what they already possessed. But because the almost like industrial production of the Greek Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, that ensured that more copies existed and were kept in places that were more likely to preserve them. And so we have the oldest version is Greek because of the Hellenistic mindset of let's preserve everything because we want our culture to survive and blah, blah, blah. The Hebraic imagination just wasn't interested in those same things. Genesis discloses a pretty clear suspicion of centralized urban power cores. I'll talk about this next week, but Cain, who's kind of this antagonist, he's the person who founds the first city. And Abel, who's kind of this anti-hero, who's killed, he's a shepherd. King David is a shepherd. And so the Hebraic imagination, for lack of a better word, has not prioritized or did not prioritize being fruitful and multiplying in the same way the Greek imagination did. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have I answered your question or have I danced around it?
I think you've answered it. I mean, what I was trying to just understand was that the various translations they've gone through before they become English. And I gather there were some dialect to Greek to Latin to English is probably the chain.
Yeah, so because of that Hellenizing project, one, we know, and scholars know, the dialect of Greek that it was composed in, Koine Greek, gives us a date or, an era, right? The 3rd century BCE. Koine Greek wasn't really popular until the 5th and the 4th century BCE. And so we have these old manuscripts written in Koine Greek. So we know, we have later copies, scribes will, copy verbatim, etc. But the language that it is written in, Koine Greek, gives us that sense of when it was. And because we have those Greek manuscripts, 21st century English all the way to 3rd millennia, I don't know, TikTokese, they're going to have those Greek Koine manuscripts to go from. And so you can make a direct translation from Koine Greek into XYZ language. But the Hebrew Masoretic text, that's not a but. The Hebrew Masoretic text of the 11th century was written by was created in Rabbinic Judaism. It's a reliable text. We just don't have copies that date before the 11th century. So we can make as many translations from that Greek Septuagint as we want. But we do have to keep in mind that there is a slight variance between the Greek imagination that shaped it, that translated from a no longer surviving Hebrew text and Hebrew authors and Hebrew imagination. There's, even if we have, and we do, that Greek not original, but we have the Greek manuscript, we still have to go behind the Greek to kind of get at the Hebrew ideas behind it. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no fragments have ever appeared of the source documents that the Greeks used in the Septuagint?
No, I think we have lots of fragments, and this is pressing the bounds of what I'd even consider my expertise. We have a lot of fragments. We have fragments in Hebrew and ancient Akkadian and all these other things. But when we talk about codices, those are, whole works of, say, the Bible.
Well,
that we
that's what
can
I mean,
rely-
of what we is recognizably as something that has come through as one
Yeah.
of the books of the Old Testament, let's say.
Yeah, we only have pieces, at least outside Greek, like Hebrew, Aramaic,
Yeah,
Akkadian, Sumerian. Like, it's a whole field. I can't, just linguistics, I guess.
but not really
Um,
have to do a side-by-side comparison of, how the translation went on the Greek side.
Yeah, I don't think we have enough that we can reliably date to before the 3rd century.
Right, okay.
Good questions. Any others before we break? And
Oops,
No, no.
no?
Nope.
No.
Okay, then that is all I have. I'm gonna hit record and stop recording a little bit, but yeah, well, I will do that email for Halloween, and we'll talk about timing. But otherwise, I may have some things to send you ahead of time to look at, and then we'll do the same basic thing here, and hopefully all of it figured out, but maybe not.
And you were going to share the slides with the different books all broken down according to the Hebrew and the
Yes,
Catholic little c.
I can do that. I'll make them pegs and send them out. All right.
Okay.
Anything else? Last minute alibis, thoughts, concerns?
No.
No.
No? All right. Well, thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you all again next week, and I'm hoping we'll be joined by Amy, Robert, and Cap.
Okay. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
All right,
Very
guys.
good. All
Have a
right.
good rest
Bye.
of your week.
You too. Bye-bye.